Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody. We are back with the Financial Times best business book of the year. They're down to 6, the short list. 2 of them are about individual technology companies. The first by Stephen Witt, The Thinking Machine, about Jensen Huang and NVIDIA, America's chip manufacturing company. We did a show with Witt a few months ago in April. And the second book on the list on individual companies is by Eva Dou, the Washington Post reporter, The House of Huawei. And I'm thrilled that Eva is joining us. Eva, congratulations on your inclusion on the list. You've written yourself about Jensen Huang at NVIDIA. You're all too familiar with him. Are there any comparisons between NVIDIA and Huawei? I know it's a rather odd way of starting our conversation, but do these companies and their founders have anything in common?
Yes, certainly. I think a couple years ago, people wouldn't have talked about the companies this way and put them together like this. Huawei was largely thought of as a telecommunications company that made the gear that made behind internet networks and phone networks, while NVIDIA was a maker of the chips that run video games. But these two have kind of converged, and that sort of speaks to the world we're in now. Right now, both of them are 2 of the most advanced makers of AI chips in the world. Huawei is sort of the main Chinese competitor to NVIDIA amid this sort of arms race for AI chips around the world. And so 2 very interesting companies.
2 very interesting companies with 2 particularly interesting founders. Jensen Huang is the leather-jacketed founder. I think he originally from Taiwan, of NVIDIA. Less well-known is Ren Zhengfei. I hope I pronounced him right. You will pronounce him correctly, Eva. The founder of Huawei, and in his own way, perhaps is more of a shaper even of Huawei than Jensen Huang of NVIDIA. Tell us about this guy. Is he quite remarkable? Is he the Steve Jobs, the Bill Gates, the Andrew Carnegie of China?
Ren Zhengfei looms very large in sort of China's business landscape, similarly to a Steve Jobs or Bill Gates in the United States. He was one of the early Chinese tech founders. Huawei was founded in 1987 when sort of private tech companies were just a pilot program in Shenzhen in China's south. And since then, he's sort of the rapid development and continued survival of this company has sort of made him a leader in China's business management. He's written a lot of essays and given a lot of speeches, and through that has developed quite a following in China. A lot of people study how he's managed this company.
Does he wear leather jackets like Jensen Huang, or is he? Some of the photos one sees of him, he's a little more conventionally dressed in a suit and tie. What does he do with all the money he's made, this guy?
Yeah, it's kind of funny that when you ask about that comparison, I think part of his success has been to be quite low key. So where Jensen Huang, he's wearing this leather jacket, he's on the stage in the spotlight. That in many ways, Ren Zhengfei has taken the opposite approach. For decades, he declined all media interviews. He rarely appeared in public at any sort of convention or any public appearance. And that was partly because their equipment, their customer base, is largely governments around the world and government owned telecom companies. And so they were quite a discreet vendor. They shunned the spotlight until very recently.
Tell us a little bit about not just Ren Zhengfei, but the company he founded, Huawei. What is its history, Eva? Give us a short history, what they do, what they produce, and why they're so important.
So why they are important is because right now Huawei is the largest manufacturer of the equipment that makes up phone networks and internet networks around the world. And they've held this position for a long time, more than a decade by now. And it's been hard for any other company to challenge them. So where they started out, they started from quite humble roots. In the late 1980s, China was starting to emerge from this completely state-controlled communist system for its economy and experimenting with capitalism. And so Huawei was one of these first private startups that was allowed to be founded in 1987 in Shenzhen. At first, they were sort of a contract manufacturer of these small phone switches. This was sort of like a box that a hotel or sort of a small or medium-sized business would have in their office that you could connect multiple phone lines into. So quite a simple sort of equipment. And from there, they branched out into all sorts of related equipment. And up to the present day, they're making AI chips. They're into robotics. They're working on autonomous vehicles. They're really one of China's technology powerhouses across the board.
In your book, you quote Ren. He says, "A country without its own program-controlled switches is like one without an army." The real question, of course, and you know this better than anyone as somebody who's covered Huawei for so long and as the author of House of Huawei, is what is the relationship between Huawei and the Chinese state, and indeed between Chen and Xi Jinping, the autocratic figure at the heart of contemporary China. Is there a close relationship? Is Huawei the product of the Chinese Communist Party, or is that oversimplistic?
You know, part of what was very interesting about researching this topic was sort of getting deep into the topic of how the relationship between technology and politics and governments. And so for technologies like telecommunications, they are crucial to a country's national security. They are crucial, seen as a crucial tool for the government. And this was something that Ren Zhengfei touched on quite early in his remarks, that a country without its own switches of this sort was like one without an army. And this is sort of...
He must have been sort of adapting Chairman Mao, it sounds like. I hope he has his own little red book, does he?
He does have sort of like his own quips and aphorisms that are sort of circulated. This kind of concept that a country needs to be sort of sufficient in certain key technologies to be a great power is one that sort of is increasingly discussed in this the U.S.-China relationship today, as we're seeing this kind of decoupling. We see this in the United States also with their investments in the chip industry, including the Trump administration taking a direct stake in Intel Corporation, a private U.S. company, recently. This is based on the same logic that, you know, there's certain technologies that are such key parts of the chain that it's a risk for the nation if there isn't government oversight.
Yeah, you're dodging the question a bit, Eva, and I certainly want to get to the comparisons between the US and China, and this are becoming increasingly self-evident in Trump's state-centric reinvention of American capitalism. But is Huawei then an extension of the state? I wasn't clear on your answer, and maybe your book isn't entirely clear. It's got rave reviews, but one or two people say, well, she circles around some of the questions, although in the Wall Street Journal review, there was a note about your observation of the way in which some things Huawei related are used in foreign policy. When Kenya's mobile network company sought to cancel a contract with Huawei, for example, its chief executive was told that Chinese foreign assistance to the country was at risk. Kenya, of course, and Africa being central to China's rare earth mineral strategy. So is there a concrete connection, or is it still kind of unclear? Is it a bit murky?
Yes. So under China's national security laws, the Communist Party of China does have the final say on any sort of major decisions a company like this would be making. So if it comes to the question of can Huawei stand up against China's government, can Huawei tell the government no? It's hard to see a way the company could do that. As far as is the government managing Huawei and directing it day to day, the way China's government works is they sort of for the most part, put out high-level directions, and sort of the private enterprise is largely supposed to figure out how to meet those goals. So some of the details a lot of the details of day-to-day management would be left up to Huawei's own executives to be making their decisions and to find the most competitive way in the global market to do so. But if it comes to sort of critical questions of can Huawei escape the government's control? Can Huawei stand up to Beijing? The answer to that would be no. And Huawei has been, part of China's sort of broad technological aspirations, sort of a major factor in their success over the years has been the state support that they've received from the national government and from regional governments across China.
We were talking about Jensen Huang's leather jackets. You have to assume one of the reasons he wears them on stage is he's made a lot of money, doesn't need to worry about buying leather jackets. Has Ren at Huawei, has he become extremely rich? What are the economics of owning or being the founder of a company in China? Are they similar to the United States? Is he a billionaire?
That is a funny question. In China,
why is it funny?
It's funny because it's politically dangerous in China to be a billionaire and to be seen as having become very wealthy in China's communist system. And this is something that Ren Zhengfei has downplayed throughout his career. He, in that many private sector billionaires in China have gone to prison for corruption. And this is something he's been very aware of. Sometimes quite early, sort of in Huawei's story, a couple of decades ago, Ren Zhengfei did make sort of international rich lists, like the Forbes rich list. And this was something he was pretty upset about, and that Huawei protested and tried to get him removed from that list. I think it's quite unclear exactly what his wealth level is. I think fair to say his stake in Huawei, one of China's most valuable companies, makes him a very wealthy individual.
Yeah, maybe that's why he doesn't wear the leather jackets on stage. He doesn't want to call attention to himself. We did a show a few months ago. It was actually a really interesting show about Xi Jinping's father. and what Xi Jinping experienced as a result of his father being both part of the ruling aristocracy, communist aristocracy in China, and then being purged and being homeless and being persecuted. What's Ren's background? Does he have a communist aristocratic background, an entrepreneurial? I mean, there's no such thing, really, I'm guessing, in communist China as a aristocratic business background. Was he from a privileged class? Did he grow up in poverty? What's his history?
He came from humble roots, and so his early experiences are quite common across China. They're reflective of a whole generation's experience. He was born in, so if you were talking earlier about Xi Jinping and his father's experience, there's parallels for Ren Dongfei's story. So he was born in 1944 in the south of China during the Chinese Civil War. His father had worked briefly for the nationalists, and so when Mao Zedong came to power, his father and his mother, they were persecuted. His father was sent to a labor camp, and this affected Ren Dongfei's career prospects for the early part of his career. He had sort of this chip on his shoulder and had said, however hard he worked, however he succeeded in the Army Engineering Corps, he never was sort of someone singled out for promotions and singled out for praise because of his family background. And this is something that he sort of carried with him. So he spent the first part of his career in the Army Engineering Corps, and this was sort of abruptly cut short when Deng Xiaoping laid off a large part of China's military. And sort of started opening up the economy for this capitalism experiment. And that's when Ren Dongfei, as someone with an engineering background, was sort of prodded to try starting his own company. And that was the beginning of Huawei.
Yeah, I'm not going to make any jokes about chips on his shoulder, given that he owns the largest chip company in China. You noted Zhang Xiaoping. Do you have any sense of his politics? Of course, Xi in China is a much less liberal version of Xi Jinping in terms of his embrace of capitalism and the role of the state. I'm probably oversimplifying, vulgarizing, but do you get any sense of his politics, or is he a tough, smart enough guy to just simply keep out of politics and keep building Huawei and becoming richer and richer, even if he can't wear leather jackets on stage?
At some point, he gave sort of an internal speech to new Huawei employees, giving them advice. This was him talking to young people in China. And he said, what he told them was, you have to align with the party. You have to be in step with them. And he said that he had spent too much of his early life sort of resisting that. And he later felt that was time wasted. So that was sort of his realignment that he came to because of his father's persecution in his early life. He sort of was standoffish from the party. He didn't join for many years. And at some point early in Huawei's history, he turned down sort of federal funds or funding from China's national government because he didn't want to be too closely tied to them. But as we've seen Huawei grow into this national champion in sort of a critical technology space, he's had to come to terms that comes with working closely with the Communist Party of China, that there's no other path.
So he's a realist. America's president, and maybe he's a wannabe Xi, is spending a lot of time with tech barons, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, of course. Does Ren spend time with Xi? Do they know each other? Do they rub shoulders? Do they dine together? Are their wives friendly?
So this is part of Huawei's low-key culture. Ren Dongfei has sort of tried to avoid showing up publicly in Beijing compared to a lot of executives. A lot of the tech stars in China come to Beijing each year for the annual sort of annual meetings, and Ren Fei notably is absent from most of those. He has been sort of appearing more often in recent years, especially as Huawei's chips have emerged as sort of such a crucial piece of China's technology sector more broadly.
You didn't get any access to him, right? You haven't. Have you interviewed Ren?
There was one brief period where Huawei opened its doors to reporters, and that was after Ren Zhengfei's daughter, Meng Wanzhou, the CFO, was detained in Canada.
Yeah, very high-profile case, and then of course she was released. Well, how long was she imprisoned or under surveillance? It was in Canada. How long was it for?
Yeah. Well, she was in a detention center sort of quite briefly and then put under house arrest, and she in Vancouver. So she was able to remain in her own house in Vancouver for several years, including going out as long as she was accompanied. And so it was during that period that Ren Dongfei did a number of media interviews. And so I was able to be part of one of the groups that went to interview him at that time.
What did you ask him? I mean, what was he like?
Well, he's this very garrulous guy. He's that's part of sort of how he's been able to lead this company and inspire them. You know, he tells these folksy stories about his own past. He uses a lot of colorful language and jokes, and he's built Huawei. He's built sort of like these surreal palaces on Huawei's grounds that are based on European palaces like Versailles. Or
yeah, I heard. Rather tasteless. I mean, he's got a bit of the Elon Musk in him. Maybe not Elon Musk. I don't know who's the most tasteless. Who's the most tasteless Silicon Valley baron? Maybe Zuckerberg takes over entire San Francisco regions and turns them into his own baronial premises.
Yeah, it's very much a kind of over-the-top nouveau riche sort of vibe.
Larry Ellison, maybe. Does he dye his hair like Larry Ellison?
I'm not sure about that, but yeah, a sort of a surreal sort of scene there. That had
what would you? I mean,
if
you could get him in a room on your own, Eva, and you had some sort of truth serum, which you could feed the guy. I mean, he's garrulous, but you indicate that perhaps his garrulousness is a way of not saying anything. If you could actually ask him one question where he'd be truthful, what would it be?
Well, he very rarely does interviews now, but
I understand. But we're getting him into a room. I'm doing you a big favor, and you can give him the truth serum. What would you ask him?
You know, I'd be interested in his predictions for what Huawei is investing in, that it sees as sort of the breakthrough technologies of the future, because he is one of the executives who's had a very good track record in the industry in sort of predicting what are the major trends that are coming up. And that's been part of Huawei's ability to succeed and thrive in such a competitive landscape.
That would be an interesting question, Ren as a futurist. But what about in terms of the history of this remarkable company? Because that's why he's interesting. He's not just a futurist. What is the most interesting thing about Huawei that you don't really know the answer to because you just don't have the access? Are there to make sense of this remarkable company? What would you ask him?
Oh, a lot of sort of Huawei's interactions with diplomacy, like China's diplomacy with other countries, we can see part of it, but a lot of it we don't fully understand. So that would be something really.
So that's like the Kenya story of whether, and maybe who's the tail and who's the dog and who's the tail? Well, who's really wagging what? Maybe Huawei's in control rather than the Chinese state. One of the things that intrigues me about Huawei and the narrative is that Huawei, in its own way, replaced the Swedish company Ericsson, or challenges the Swedish company Ericsson. I'm quite familiar with Ericsson as the dominant Western manufacturer of equipment. Shall we say, the company that makes the switches for the internet. And of course, the reason why Ericsson, I've spent some time at their offices in Stockholm. I've interviewed their former CEO, became the CEO of Verizon many times, is that their power and success was rooted in being Swedish and being in their own way neutral. So it seems to me that one of the more remarkable aspects of Huawei was building this company as a competitor to Ericsson. It's a kind of challenge to the idea of neutrality. Is that fair? And I don't quite know how they did it.
Yeah, that's a great observation, that companies like Ericsson and Nokia, being based in Scandinavia, are seen sort of as politically neutral, and that's been part of their success. So that's part of what I was getting to, in saying it would be interesting to learn more about how Huawei's intertwined with diplomacy, because we know Huawei executives, since sort of early in their history, have traveled together with Chinese officials on these diplomatic missions, on diplomatic trips around the world. And a lot of their deals were signed with China's top leaders and foreign leaders sort of present for the signing. And so, yes, I think at least some of these deals represent these countries around the world wanting better relations and more trade with China, and closer ties to China's government. There's definitely a political layer to it. When you look around the world and see which countries have banned Huawei equipment and which ones continue to use it, that very much is a political decision, rooted in how those countries feel about the US government and how they feel about China's government and their relationship to both countries.
So in a way, the history of Huawei is a way of understanding the new Cold War. I want to come to the American perspective on this and the American involvement in Huawei in a second. But when companies invest in Huawei equipment, when a country like Kenya, for example, does a deal with Huawei, is it a kind of technological golden handcuff? Are they tying themselves, as some critics, some China hawks have said, to China's version of surveillance by putting Huawei, by networking, wiring their company up with Huawei gear and technology? Are they incorporating themselves, potentially at least, into the kind of surveillance system that Xi is building in China itself?
I think for the officials sort of and the cybersecurity experts in countries around the world looking at this question, I think they have no illusions that if you use equipment from a certain country, that makes you more susceptible to hacking from entities in that country. And whether that's equipment from China, like Huawei or ZTE gear, or equipment from the US, like Cisco routers. And so for third countries, so it often is a question of just which country sphere of influence they feel they want to be a part of.
Yeah, but if you buy Ericsson equipment, you're not risking ICE observation or Donald Trump being able to figure out what you're doing. There is a difference fundamentally between a company like Ericsson or Nokia and a company like Huawei, isn't there?
Perhaps. And another factor in here is the cost differential. Ericsson
Right.
equipment is just for many sorts of things, multiple times more expensive than Huawei's offering. And so there's a cost calculation there, like what degree of security, which is sort of this vague concept, are you willing to pay a premium for? And so for a number of countries, they do use Huawei in sort of peripheral networks that they consider to be less carrying less sensitive information, and they use sort of more expensive equipment from other brands for what they see as critical networks.
Yeah, I wonder whether the history of Huawei and their ability to take on so successfully in economic terms Ericsson and Nokia should be a warning to OpenAI and Anthropic in terms of Chinese AI upstarts like DeepMind.
Yeah, potentially. We are in a period right now where sort of the nationalities of technology are scrutinized much more closely than before. I guess one thing to remember is for intelligence agencies, they are not restricted by the nationalities of equipment. One thing that we learned from Snowden's revelations about a decade ago was that the US government, in fact, was using Huawei networks and Huawei equipment to surveil their targets.
That's ironic. Yeah, I hadn't realized that. That's a fascinating note. Your hero of your book, or maybe the anti-hero Ren, is, I know you note how committed he is to hard work, which is not unusual in China. Perhaps he's the hardest of hard workers, or Huawei is made up of the hardest of hard-working culture in the country. Is that why Huawei was able to take on Ericsson? Why their products, why their technology is so much cheaper? Is there the labor aspect of simply paying their workers less, or are there other efficiencies or innovation involved in driving the price down of Huawei and making their products, their technology more competitive than Ericsson? Or maybe is there a state element too?
Both. Huawei is a company known for sort of keeping a very lean sort of structure, in that they lay off employees every year and really drive their employees very hard, to the point that there was a period where workers were sort of dropping to death at their desks. And there was this major upcry in China about how hard Huawei pushed its employees to work and its work culture. And it's reined itself in somewhat since then. But that's definitely one element of it. Huawei's top leadership have been telling their engineers that, they are pressed on time. The one resource they're limited on most is time for catching up with their Western rivals, and that means sort of working around the clock. That's very much been part of their culture and part of how the company operates. As you mentioned, state support, that's also part of it. Sort of financing from China's policy banks has also been a major part in them being able to sort of pursue ambitious R&D projects and expand around the world.
Well, as you note, it became a lightning rod for this increasing tension between the United States, or the West, and China. Ren's daughter was arrested. She was the Huawei CFO by Canada. How did the US convince the Canadians to do their dirty work?
Well, the US government put a request to Canada. Some of that is still unclear exactly exactly how they convinced Canada to help them or what they said. Um, but there are agreements that between the two countries that if there's a request for law enforcement, the other will help out. And so this was a request that was put out that by the U.S. that
Was this under the Biden administration?
this was under the first Trump administration.
Okay, so they got away with it with Trump. Do you think they could get away with it again? I'm not sure if the Canadians would be as keen on doing Trump's dirty work this time around, given his tariff policy.
Canada suffered a lot of fallout from the detention of Meng Wanzhou, and I think that's definitely made them more cautious about sort of what their role is in relation to these U.S. and U.S. policy efforts, especially with the U.S. sort of threatening tariffs and other enforcement against Canada itself.
Was this episode, it struck me, not that I'm an expert, as slightly shameful, picking on the daughter of the founder of the company, who happens to be the CFO, arresting her in China, house arrest, and then releasing her. Was it a bit of a shameful episode, do you think, Eva? In not just in Canadian, but in the Western attitudes and approach, policy towards China?
Well, it certainly was unconventional for this kind of case to often, usually they don't involve these kind of detentions of senior executives and family members of the founders of companies. Like ZTE, for instance, had faced a somewhat similar case under the first Trump administration that they were able to settle through just the payment of money to the U.S. government. So this very much was a shock to the industry that the U.S. would take this kind of gloves off approach. And I think it has affected sort of the calculation on both sides of what they should be prepared for ever since.
Seems like Xi in China pioneered a kind of state-centric authoritarian capitalism. And in some ways, and your reporting at the Washington Post reflects this, the US seems to be following all sorts of connections between ICE and immigration, not just connected with Trump's 100% tariffs on China, but you've written about Apple's compliance with Justice Department demand to remove the ICE block app, and Trump's, of course, endless fiddling with TikTok. Do you think that the Chinese Huawei model now is being copied by the US? The US are always accusing the Chinese of copying their technology and model, but are the tables turned now as the US decided that the Chinese model works, that this intimate connection between big companies like Huawei and the state is the future, and so Donald Trump is trying to do the same thing in the United States?
Yeah, I think we are in a moment in the United States, of sort of profound moment of figuring out what our governance and economic system should be and what it will be. I think in the United States, many people for many years did not dismissed out of hand the idea of copying China's model because of the repressive political system and just the belief that their economic programs would not work out. And this is new. We are seeing the U.S. trying to copy China's model in some, at least some elements, and experimenting with which parts will work and which parts won't.
You noted that Ren was rather garrulous, laughing at his own jokes. Do you think him and Xi are rather amused by what's happening in America?
Perhaps. Perhaps amused, but also recognizing that any sort of escalated trade war between the two countries is going to be very economically painful for China, even if there are side effects for the U.S. as well.
But for a company like Huawei, Trump's 100% tariffs doesn't make any difference. They don't really sell much in the US anyway, do they?
Yeah, that's true. I think for a company like Huawei, they're more concerned about the U.S. export controls on shipping technology like chips to China. This is one element that is ongoing in negotiations between the U.S. and China. Just what kind of advanced technologies are allowed to be traded between the two countries. So that question is going to, could very well have major effects for companies like Huawei and what they're able to build.
Fascinating. Well, the FT Book of the Year award. I know they have an early December dinner in London where they'll announce the winner. If you win, Eva, I think you should buy your friend Ren a leather jacket. Would you do that?
I don't know that he would accept it, but that's something I'll keep in mind. Thank you very much for having me.